Hello class, welcome to our 5th lecture video on Unit 4 in regards to photosynthesis. In this lecture video we're going to discuss the chemical batteries that are going to be both made and used during photosynthesis. When I say chemical batteries, I mean potential energy sources that will be created and then used to make glucose later down the line. So the first of the two types is called ATP, and we've heard that quite a few times already so far this year. We've been using that phrase. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So what I want you to know about ATP is the following. So first, it is, again, the energy currency of the cell. This is the form of money that every potential reaction in your body is going to want to use. All right, this is the currency. It wants to use ATP and no other form of energy. Even the food that you eat, when you consume food for energy, what you're ultimately doing is converting that potential energy in the food that you ate into this ATP form. So as I just said, when you break down your food, what you're ultimately really doing is you're releasing electrons from the food that you eat, one bond at a time, and those electrons will eventually be stored in a molecule of ATP. And we'll see how that happens a little bit more in the process of cellular respiration, which will be Unit 5. So ATP, to remind you, is a nucleotide, and we learned this back in our biochemistry unit, Unit 2 this year. All right, and again, nucleotides are considered the building blocks of the macromolecule nucleic acids. So an ATP molecule is a nucleotide, but it does differ a little bit, and I'll show you over in the diagram here in a moment. So first, all right, it's going to have a sugar called ribose, and that's always going to be in the middle. That's the easiest way to remember where the sugar is going to be. It's a 5-carbon sugar. All right, here will be the first carbon, second at this point, third at this point, fourth at this point, and fifth at this point. All right, which is then connected to a nitrogen over here for this component. But ribose is the sugar, always found in the middle. Then you'll have a nitrogen-containing base. Here are all those nitrogens, called adenine. When you do connect it to this entire molecule, it is referred to then as adenosine, but by itself, it would be called adenine, simply a molecule containing nitrogen. And then the third component, which is the most important, are the 3 phosphate groups that are attached to the ribose sugar. So the phosphates are always attached to the sugar ribose, not to the nitrogen-containing base adenine. So I'm going to number these for you right now. So I want you to remember what the numbers are. There's 3 of them, right? We're not going to name this one number 1 on the far outside of the molecule. We're always going to number 1 on that first phosphate group that's attached actually to ribose. So here's your first phosphate group, your second, and then the outermost one would be the third when you see it actually as this molecule here with 3 phosphate groups as an ATP molecule. That's the key difference really, are these 2 phosphates. Between any other regular type of nucleotide. Most other nucleotides in your DNA or RNA only have a single phosphate group, a sugar, and then a nitrogen base. And that sugar would either be ribose or deoxyribose. So the key difference right now between an ATP molecule, which is a nucleotide based in comparison to a regular nucleotide found in DNA or RNA, is ATP is going to have an additional 2 phosphate groups versus just 1. Now, where is all the energy really stored in this molecule? Why is this the energy currency of the cell? All right, when we look at the overall structure here with 3 phosphate groups, again, this outermost phosphate would be the 3rd phosphate group. We want to think of this as a fully charged battery. All right, all the energy in this molecule truly is in this bond right here. All right, and that's the bond between the 3rd and 2nd phosphate groups. Or you could say the bond between the 2nd and 3rd phosphate group. Either way is fine. All right. Now, why does that have a large amount of energy there in that bond in particular? All right. Each of these phosphate groups are negatively charged, and they have a strong negative charge. Remember, like charges repel each other while opposites attract. So when you have 3 atoms here that have a very strong negative charge overall, they're going to be repelling each other, especially when you compress them. In the next slide I'm going to show you, I want you to think of these 3 phosphate groups as a compressed spring. All right, there's a lot of potential energy in there, but it wants to explode. So the idea is once you break that bond between the second and third phosphate groups, or third and second, however you prefer to think of it, you release energy, and that energy can be used to drive a reaction. And then you've drained the battery, so ATP becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. You only have 2 phosphate groups. This is a more stable form for this molecule because really, you don't really see it here, but these 2 phosphates will spread out a little bit further from each other. So imagine me dragging this phosphate maybe over to here. So the 2 negative charges really don't interact with each other that much, and you have a more stable molecule. But when you add a third phosphate group eventually back on, all of these 3 phosphates get much closer together, and you have a molecule that is relatively unstable. It's going to want to eventually break down. So again, remember where all that potential energy is stored, right here in the bond between the second and third phosphate groups. And the idea is here, between what we're going to be learning in photosynthesis and cellular respiration, is ATP, right? Is created using energy either from sunlight or the food that you consume. So it depends if you're a plant or an animal. Eventually, you'll use that potential energy stored in this molecule. When you break off the third phosphate group, that releases a large amount of energy to drive a reaction. ADP, which is now stable but is uncharged, you can recharge that and add a third phosphate group onto it. ATP synthase would do that, if you recall, by having yet another input of energy, either from sunlight or the food that you consume if you're a herbivore. So again, in conclusion for ATP, what I want you to think of it is as when you add that third phosphate group, it's like compressing a spring. So you have a large amount of potential energy right now. And when that bond right there between the second and third phosphate groups is broken, it's like launching a little rocket or a firework up into the air. All right? And that launching mechanism is what's going to drive a reaction. Ultimately, when you add this phosphate group to another molecule, it causes it to change. So that's where that change or really energy force is coming from. All right, ATP can be used for anything in your body whatsoever, but here are just 3 examples. One here we already discussed, active transport. So if you want to pump sodium ions here against their gradient to the outside of a cell, all right, that's not going to happen naturally. So you would take an ATP molecule, add one of those 3 phosphate groups to this integral membrane protein, and that forces the change of the shape of this protein. So there's your driving reaction. There's the energy being provided. That phosphate group will alter the shape, releasing the nitrogens. All right, eventually, ADP now is produced. That is the uncharged molecule. And a third phosphate would eventually be re-released. And then either during photosynthesis or cellular respiration, you would add that third phosphate back on the ADP to make ATP. Muscle contraction. When your muscles contract and relax, you're using ATP. So right now, when you see this little arm here on one of your 2 muscle fibers, actin and myosin, all right, it is helping to, believe it or not, relax your muscles. So right now, that'd be contracted. ATP relaxes. See how it lets this little protein or muscle filament release this one? So this would be contracting your muscle, that would be relaxing. So you need ATP to relax it. And a third example, again just a third of many, would be building polymers. Remember we talked about condensation reactions? So I'm adding a smaller unit to a larger one here in this GIF. All right, right there to make it even bigger. Add another one. Boom, it's getting longer. All right, these little molecules here that you'll see come off here in a second, that would be water. Well, guess what molecule is adding these smaller monomer units to a growing polymer? ATP is helping do that. ATP is what helps break the bond and form a new one, releasing water as a waste product. And our second and last chemical battery that we are going to learn about here and see being produced during the first part of photosynthesis, the light reactions, is called NADPH. We're going to remember it like that. We're not going to remember this. It actually stands for nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Try to say that 5 times real fast, right? Not going to be able to. So, the oxidized form is NADP+, the uncharged form that's missing electrons. All right, what we're going to see is, during the light reactions, the first step in photosynthesis, this molecule will accept a pair of electrons coming from an electron transport chain. When it accepts a pair of electrons, NADP+ becomes reduced, and the fully charged version of it would be NADPH. So during the light reactions, we're going to see that NADP+ is the final electron acceptor that is being used. NADPH is going to be used to help produce glucose during the second part of photosynthesis that we call the Calvin cycle. So during the light reactions, we're charging batteries. We're making ATP and we're making NADPH. And then both NADPH and ATP will be used to make glucose during the Calvin cycle. So in essence, what we're going to be doing once again is taking a molecule of NADP+, the oxidized form. Light will be used to add a pair of electrons as well as a hydrogen ion to this molecule here, fully charge it up to produce the reduced form that's called NADPH. All right, in essence, in this little picture here, during photosynthesis in the light reactions, light is going to be used to excite electrons. They come down an electron transport chain that is used to make ATP. And then eventually you put these electrons to a high energy state, meaning that you're giving them to a molecule, NADPH, that can be used to make a molecule that has a lot more potential energy, and that's going to be glucose. All right, so again, NADP+ will be turned into NADPH during the light reactions. First step in photosynthesis, by adding a pair of electrons and a hydrogen ion to make NADPH, and then both ATP and NADPH will be used to make glucose during the Calvin cycle.